Hello, it's Peter here, just going through the Assessment 3, Earth and Space Sciences Year 6, Exemplar Lesson Plan. I'm hoping lots of you by now have had a chance to look at the flip to collaborate and then have a look at this lesson through the eyes of an ELA and what we would be looking for when we're marking specifically to this lesson. And also keeping in mind our marking criteria, which you was sent as an attachment as well. Now, hopefully it won't take too long, but I'd like to go through this with a bit more of a fine-tooth comb and I'll pop the feedback in written form up on the Padlet and also as a reply to your week 9 activity. The feedback I'm providing now is a lot longer and more detailed than what you would get in your feedback for your submissions. And also keep in mind that this student submitted 2 lesson plans. So we're just looking at one for now. So the mark that this student gets for this lesson would be combined with the mark they get from the next lesson. But I've just done it as a standalone out of 100% for this particular lesson. So let's have a look. You need to take into consideration the background, the school context, the class information. So I'll just quickly go through this again. The school context, it's a well-resourced inner suburban school with a very active parent community. Community and parental involvement is highly encouraged. The school has interactive whiteboards in every classroom. The school backs on to a large nature reserve. These things must be considered in your plan. Class information, Year 6, 18 students. One of the students has a mother who is a geologist and has agreed to contribute within science lesson. The class includes a variety of learning styles including visual, kinesthetic and oral. The content in this lesson, and this is mandatory, the first 2 content descriptors, science understanding, sudden geological changes or extreme weather conditions can affect the Earth's surface. Science involves testing predictions and gathering data using evidence to develop explanations of events and phenomena and reflects historical and cultural contributions. This one, the science inquiry skill, the student has chosen themselves. They've chosen this one. Construct and use a range of representations, including tables, graphs, to represent and describe observations, patterns, or relationships in data using digital technologies as appropriate. And the design technology link they have chosen was to develop project plans that include consideration of resources when making designed solutions individually and collaboratively. Now, there's been some fantastic participation on the discussion boards, and I did note that lots of you felt a little challenged at being critical of a student's plan, and that it's quite difficult to mark them sometimes. So we're always looking for the positives, but we also have to mark to the criteria. So if there are things missing or things done incorrectly, we need to mark accordingly. So let's go through this one. I'm going to have a look at the activities, resources and experiences column first. So this is criteria 1, basically. The justification is criteria 2, and criteria 3 is a combination of both. So let's look at this one. So they've included an introduction and they've timed it. This is really important. This is a positive. They've split the lesson up into timed sections. Resources have been included for the introduction. So what's needed to deliver this part of the lesson. They've split it up into steps. It's quite clear. They've used dot points. And so the steps in groups of 2, students think, pair, share their ideas about what natural disaster is. They write on the chart paper using one colour. The teacher plays the video on the interactive whiteboard, which it has said in the description that the school has in every classroom, and asks the students to write any that they missed in a different colour. This is natural disasters. So using colour coding is quite a nice idea. Thinking about think, pair, share is also a good idea, a good teaching strategy. So the body of the lesson, this is timed, which is good, 1 hour. Resources for this are included. So another video, laptops, a website address, Microsoft Word. I'm not sure whether that's a necessarily resource, but the students made sure they've thought of everything that needed to be on the laptops. So the steps: play the video on the interactive whiteboard. Whole class teacher-led student-centred discussion about video. It's a lot here. We'll unpack that in a minute. Discuss the impacts. There are some strategies there, which is good that they've considered. Discuss the impacts an earthquake might have on the earth, the environment, and people and animals. This is a nice discussion to have, to make the kids interested and start thinking about the activity. Display the earthquake's website on the interactive whiteboard and instruct students how to use it. So zoom out to display the whole world, click on yellow, so there's a bit of detail here, and show students how to use it, which is important that you do actually show students how to use things. However, it'll be looked at as another lesson in itself. So you might need to think about, well, do they have experience in this or not? And is this taking up valuable time in your particular lesson? So students go back to their desks, using a laptop, log on to earthquakes, so there's some nice clear steps for any teacher to follow. Hand out blank world maps, and there is an appendix down the bottom, which is fantastic to include an appendix. That's another bonus to this one. Plot on maps where the earthquakes have occurred in the last 7 days. Encourage students to look for patterns. Does a certain continent have more activity than others? Does a certain country have more activity than others? Students need to create a graph in Microsoft Word to display the magnitude of earthquakes and the locations from the map. Look for new patterns. And the conclusion. And it's important that every lesson has a conclusion. So the conclusion time is 20 minutes. The resources for this: wooden blocks and tables. In groups of 2 or 3, discuss design ideas on how to effectively build a structure that would withstand a light to medium earthquake. So there's some strategies here, small group work. Build a structure with wooden blocks. Once constructed, one group at a time with the rest of the class observing. Gently shake the table and evaluate how effective the design was. And here's the appendix. Now I'm going to go back up to the top of this. So most of the required learning content, if you're thinking about criteria 1, was evident in the plan. The lesson was generally clear and easy to follow and included some logical connections between the different content knowledge and the skill development. Now, thinking about the timing, it would have been really difficult to incorporate all of those planned elements within a 1.5 hour time frame. So the introduction, body and conclusion, they were linked to the appropriate Australian curriculum concepts, but they did read a little bit like separate lessons. So some effective teaching strategies were included. So think, pair, share, viewing videos to engage, working in pairs, small groups, some inclusion of questioning and consideration of assessment strategies. But the implementation of the think, pair, share was probably a little bit basic for a year 6. Think, pair, share is really a routine for active reasoning and explanation, so it delves a little bit deeper. And generally, this strategy is used to promote understanding through the children actively making considerations and reasoning and then explaining, and it encourages them by working with other students to listen to each other and understand different perspectives. So I'm not really sure that strategy was used effectively there. So it wasn't really evident, and it seemed more like they were making a list of what a natural disaster was, which is an okay thing to do, but I don't think it really worked for this lesson. So to bring out higher order thinking and be more age appropriate, it probably would have been better to consider what a natural disaster might be, what might cause them, and what are consequence effects. So that would be more a think, pair, share with 3 different columns perhaps for this year level. And so you could include a graphic organiser to do this. That might have been a bit more beneficial, and particularly used in terms of pre and post assessment. So maybe the think, pair, share should have been at the beginning, and the conclusion might have been the second colour coding of that and reflecting on it. Now, this lesson, from my perspective as a teacher, relied very heavily on video viewing, using software and student self-direction. It would have been much better to have a little bit more teacher input and modelling. The questions asked, they were closed questions. Now, it's really good that some questions were considered, and in a lesson plan it's very good to include example questions you might ask a student to promote deeper thinking. But you've got to keep in mind that you're encouraging more than a yes-no answer, and that's all these ones did. So it would have been good to have the assessment included in the body of the lesson with more clarity too, even though it was alluded to, I think, with the think, pair, share, with the colour coding. The science understanding content descriptor, sudden geological changes or extreme weather conditions can affect the Earth's surface, I can't say that, was addressed via assumed content of the video and the consequent discussion and activity. Now, this needed to be addressed with a bit more detail, and to also take advantage of the school context and the class description provided in the template. The mapping activity seemed to be more related to geography, which is okay, rather than developing science concepts. So you need to be careful with these sort of things. Now, the class context and the school context, they were not taken into consideration at all here, and not utilised and not taken advantage of. And that is a huge oversight throughout the whole lesson. The next content descriptor, science as human endeavour. Science involves testing predictions by gathering and using gathering data and using evidence to develop explanations of events and phenomena, and reflects historical and cultural contributions. That was generally addressed by using information gathered from the app and locating the places on the map to show patterns of earthquakes. So yeah, that was quite an okay way of doing something, and I'm sure students will quite like doing this activity. But this might have been better as a completely separate activity. There's clearly 2 distinct activities here. It might have been better as a follow-up activity. Also, creating a graph using Microsoft Word, that's a good idea. However, this also seems to be a standalone activity and doesn't really effectively address testing predictions. It's more about presenting information. So using a tool like this or like those is certainly appropriate in many cases, but doesn't really allow the students to gain hands-on experience to develop their understandings of this particular concept. So rather, the video and the application and software, they were passive ways of being provided information and really didn't require much teacher input at all. The science inquiry skill chosen, construct and use a range of representations, including tables and graphs, to represent and describe observations, patterns or relationships in data using digital technologies as appropriate, was met again via viewing the video and marking the places of the earthquake activity. So kind of matched, they sort of blended those 2 together reasonably well. So they created the graph on Microsoft Word. So the idea is good, however, again, a bit of a standalone lesson, or you need to make sure that students have prior knowledge of how to use this program, because that's assumed in this plan. And it also seems to be doubling up, like they're just doing the same thing over, just presenting it a different way. And it, again, would be so hard to include all of this in an hour and a half. The design technology link chosen by the student. There's a little bit of a problem here. So develop project plans that include consideration of resources when making design solutions individually and collaboratively. Great link was not effectively addressed at all, apart from the conclusion, which was based on design technology, but not clearly developed. It seems to be a standalone activity again, add-on, doesn't really link to anything within the body of the lesson. It's definitely not a conclusion. And it doesn't effectively address consideration of the resources even, as only wooden blocks are provided. So they're not really considering design solutions there. A design brief wasn't included, and in the rationale it was mentioned that the project planning was involved in the conclusion. However, this wasn't evident in the body of the plan. Another big oversight, no safety considerations were included at all, and this is essential. I'll just quickly pop this up here. So for criteria 1, this is a 22% pass, okay? So let's have a look at this. The required learning contents present within the plan, yes. However, the planning lacks clarity. So it's a little bit all over the place, this plan. The planning demonstrates limited use of contemporary science pedagogical principles. So there's not a lot of a structure there in regards to explicit and deliberate planning and teaching on the students' behalf that submitted this. Demonstrates a limited understanding of how teaching approaches are chosen to support the teaching of the specified learning outcomes, including Australian curriculum content knowledge, but has not considered how the class context may also impact on this choice. So this really lowered the mark here. They did not consider the class context. A little bit of consideration in there would have definitely lifted this up because it was reasonably well written. So on first glance, it's doesn't look too bad, but when you think about what we've provided and the expectations, they have not met it. And safety considerations are noted. That's for a pass. Now, there were no safety considerations noted, but the other areas have brought that up to a pass. I'll just minimise this. So let's have a look at the justification now. So just get my papers in order. So criterion 2. The justifications included some good explanation of how the activity is chosen to support the teaching of the particular Australian curriculum content descriptors. So while the concepts presented in the plan, as prescribed by Swinburne, are generally accurate, it's a fairly dry lesson, I don't think is particularly engaging. I know grade 6s will quite like doing all the elements of this, but in this, given that there's a nature reserve backing onto this school and a parent geologist and plenty of parents who are more than happy to participate by making this an absolutely fantastic, hands-on, dynamic lesson, I would say this is a pretty dry way to achieve the goals of these content descriptors. The plan's not clearly taken the class description and context into consideration at all. In the rationale, it does state, this lesson incorporates use of the interactive whiteboard and laptop and includes a variety of learning styles. This particular lesson does not require parent participation. However, upcoming lessons within the unit allow for this. Now, as an ELA marking this, that's not really an academic way of justifying why you haven't done it. We don't want to hear why you haven't done something. We want to hear why you have. So I would like explicit explanation of how the lesson has catered for a variety of learning styles, as in the class description. Also, simply saying parent participation is not required is not really a consideration of the class context. Really, it's just acknowledging that the student, they've read the class description and context, but they've chosen not to include them in their planning. And I'm really not sure why they didn't do that. So in this particular lesson, the student should have taken advantage of the parent geologist and the fact that the school backs on to a nature reserve. Oral and visual learning styles were catered for, but not clearly discussed in the rationale. This should have been discussed. How were they catered for? The kinesthetic learning styles enjoyed by many in the class were not clearly considered and seemed to be an add-on to the end of the lesson in the design technology activity, and really not linked to the lesson at all. Safety considerations and class context were briefly mentioned, but not addressed in the plan or explained in the justification. The rationale states, this particularly comes into effect during the conclusion of the lesson where students are expected to include safe work practices and minimise risk. I'll show you that down here, just here. So I've mentioned something. Now, school information, class context and safety consideration needs to be explicit and addressed clearly. So how were the safety considerations addressed? In the case of this activity, adhering to internet guidelines, safe online practices such as not providing personal information and only accessing websites provided by the teacher. They're good ones to think of. There's probably many more. Also, when viewing this video, all tripping hazards need to be removed. Students need to be able to view the video comfortably. They're just a couple of considerations. Now, the rationale did make some links to the 5 E's. I'm just having a look down here. Down here. The 5 E's engage stage, and also how parts of the activity could be used as effective assessment. This is great. We really want you to make links to effective pedagogy and justify why you've done it. And of course, assessment's an important strategy that teachers use to inform the teaching and learning of everything. So, how the lesson linked to the engage stage could have been discussed in much more detail. Some indication of where the lesson might sit in a 5 E's approach could also have been briefly included. So where might it sit in the unit? The student's spoken about other lessons and something that might happen later, but it's very, very vague. The Think, Pair, Share activity as assessment is a great way of recording information, and it would have been good to have in the body of the lesson with more clarity. Science understanding, okay, so I've just lost my place. Yeah, so the Think, Pair, Share activity doesn't really connect with the main content of the following activity. So locating areas on a map and plotting earthquake zones doesn't really build on the introduction. So they're not clearly linked. The introduction was talking about defining natural disasters. Then suddenly they're plotting earthquake zones. There's not a great deal of learning going on there. There's learning, but it's not really sequential. So the justifications of the science pedagogical choices, the teaching choices made when planning the lessons, did include a reasonably good range of literature to support it, which was good. So you can see Scamp, Clegg, Erickson. There's some good ones here. I think Primary Connections is mentioned, and of course the Australian curriculum links. So there are some good things here, but a lot of things missing, and it's could be vastly improved. So criterion 3, the ideas of the plans were presented in a generally well-structured and logical order, which is true. clear, concise language has been used throughout. So, you know, play the video on the IWB. That's good. It's more like a recipe. We don't want big, long, full sentences in the dot point bits. It would just take up valuable word count and just means it's much easier for us to read and for any teacher to follow if they need to. And in the justification, it was quite well written. A couple of paragraphing issues there. Some minor grammatical and a couple of, you know, sort of spelling typos are evident, nothing terrible. The APA referencing style's been appropriately used. There is no reference list on this, as it's only one lesson plan, and you don't really need it for the purposes of this activity. So for criteria 2, 25 out of 40 are credit. So if you have a look at this, so they've got most of the past things here, identifies how some of the activities and experiences and resources chosen would support the teaching of the particular Australian curriculum content descriptors. They've done that. There's been some reference to class context, very, very vague, but, you know, we try to be as kind in our marking as possible in relation to the selection of lesson elements. This is where it's really fallen down, and it was actually quite hard to give this a credit, but the other areas are there. Limited discussion of contemporary science pedagogy supported by minimal readings. So they've got more than minimal readings and probably a little bit more than limited discussion. So it's a low credit for this criteria at 25, so 24 is, you know, just over the line. Broadly explains how the activities, experiences and resources chosen would support the teaching of the particular Australian curriculum content descriptors. They've done that. Some connections have been made as to why elements have been chosen with reference to class context. Very loosely done, not strong at all. Now, it could have easily been a lower mark for this. So, makes reference to contemporary science pedagogy and is supported by some academic reading. They definitely did that. And the academic expression, 15 out of 20, so a distinction for that. They actually did a good job. That's lifted their mark up a little bit, but that's only worth 20% of the overall mark. So their ideas are presented in a well-structured and logical order. There are very few spelling errors or problems with grammar, and external sources are generally referenced correctly, but there are minor errors in the APA style. So they've pretty much nailed all of this. So overall, a 62%. So 62 out of 100, which is a credit. Now, there were quite a range of marks given by you guys, and but most of you picked up the really glaring issue that they didn't address the school context and that the lesson plan was actually quite disjointed and it appeared to be separate lessons, particularly the conclusion, which did not really address the criteria effectively. So I hope this has helped you have a think about how you, if you chose the grade 6 template, how you might address this more effectively than this student. And also just remember, take care not to copy things directly from these exemplars. But thank you for your time, and it took a little bit longer to go through than I planned, but hopefully the next one will be a little bit shorter. And please keep posting. This is going to be so good for your lesson planning when you go out into pracs, when you're a teacher. I still write lesson plans. I write units of work all the time. We all do. It is our bread and butter. So you really take care. Have a good read through this, if not now, later. And I'll post the marks up and the feedback. It's very detailed feedback given. All right. Thank you for participating and see you next week.